How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert told us all about energy and the importance of relativity, and then he told us so much more, and these are things that we shouldn't ignore. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert implored us to look deep into nature, and then we'd understand everything that occurs. He said nature's most beautiful gift would be how our comprehension to shift. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert said if we can lull our pause to wonder and stare in raw awe of something like thunder. And this is the part that gets in my head, 'cause he said we'd be as good as dead. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert told us our task is to make ourselves free, and compassion for all living creatures was key. He said to embrace the whole of nature and its beauty we would favor. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert taught us the problems we cannot fix if the same of consciousness is in the mix, and that humanity was falling behind what technology was doing to humankind. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert said imagination's everything and to not stop questioning. He said curiosity has its own reasons for existence. The life's coming attractions could be seen in the distance. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert noted imagination's everywhere, but logic will only get us from here to there, and that reality is just an illusion, albeit a very persistent intrusion. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? Albert let us know, of course, that peace could not be kept by force. Understanding, he believed, was how peace could be achieved. How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? How can you argue with a mind like that? Even Stephen Hawking wouldn't go to bat. How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart? How can you tear his arguments apart unless you were just as smart?